The quadratic formula is one formula I'm going to ask you to memorize. There's a little song that goes to Pop Goes the Weasel that helps you remember. It says, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. That's a good way to remember how to do it. Now remember, when you're solving the quadratic formula, the coefficient of x squared, that's your a. The coefficient of x, that's your b. The constant term, that's your c. The quadratic formula has to equal to 0 before you use it. So if we take a look at example 1, so it's more like factoring and graphing. We have to make it equal to 0. So on the first question here, the first thing we want to do is we want to move that 33 to the other side. So we're going to say x squared, that is really thick because I made it bigger. So we get x squared minus 8x minus 33 equals 0. In this particular problem, let's write them down. A is the coefficient of your x term, so a is 1. B is negative 8. So we'll talk about how we do that in a second. And C is negative 33. So we're going to solve this by using the quadratic formula. Well, I've always thought the best way to memorize a formula is write it down every time until you got it memorized. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So x equals the opposite of b. Well, if b is already a negative, what's the opposite of negative? Well, it'll be a positive, so 8 plus or minus the square root of negative 8 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 33 all over 2 times 1. Now it's just a question of simplifying it. So we get x equals 8 plus or minus, well, negative 8 squared is 64. A negative times a negative is a positive. Let me see, that will be 4 times 33 should be 122. $126. 122. Well, let's use a calculator. 4 times 33. $132. That's why it wasn't registered. Something wasn't registered in my head, and that's what it was. Okay, all over 2. So x equals 8 plus or minus. Well, what's 64 plus 132? Yeah. Try to save time. Instead, I wasted it. Equals 196. All over 2. So then we get x equals 8 plus or minus 14 all over 2. Well, let's do that. 8 plus 14 is 22 over 2, which is 11. 8 minus 14 is negative 6 over 2, which is negative 3. So x equals 11 or x equals negative 3. Notice when I get nice whole numbers like that, that tells me I probably could have just factored this and found the answer. Let's take a look at example 2. So on example 2, notice it already equals 0, doesn't it? So in this problem, A is 1, B is negative 34, and C is 289. So x equals negative b, got ahead of myself, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So x equals, well, what's the opposite of a negative 34? It's positive 34. Plus or minus negative 34 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 289. My, what a big answer we have here. All over 2 times 1. So x equals, excuse me, 34 plus or minus, well, let's take the square root of, let's square 34. So 34 squared is 1156. Minus 4 times 289. Which is also 1156. Oh, how nice that is. All over 2. So you get 34 over 2. Because 1156 minus 1156 is 0, so you only get one answer. So this is 1, x equals 17. This is a parabola that only touches your graph once. Let's take a look at another one. Example 3. On this one, it's equal to 0. A is 1. B is negative 6. C is 2. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So we're going to do the opposite of negative 6, which is 6, plus or minus, this will be negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 2. All over 2 times 1. So now we're going to get x equals 6 plus or minus 36 all minus 8 all over 2. Well, we can simplify 36 minus 8. That's 28 all over 2. Oh, we finally get to a problem that the quadratic formula works better than factoring or graphing. Because the square root of 28 is an irrational number, isn't it? Let's go over to the side here. Let's simplify the square root of 28. Well, 2 goes into 28 14 times. 2 goes into 14 7 times. So you have the square root of 2 squared times the square root of 7, which is 2 radical 7. So that's what we're going to write there. So we're going to say 6 plus or minus 2 radical 7 all over 2. Well, notice 2 goes into both of them. I'm going to split those up. I'm going to say x equals, I'm going to write with a common denominator, 6 over 2 plus 2 radical 7 over 2. So 6 over 2 is 3. Notice the 2's reduce, and you get plus or minus the square root of 7, and there's your answer. So x equals 3 plus or minus the square root of 7. Now, you could use your calculator and say 3 plus the square root of 7. and round that and say it's 5.6. And if I do 3 minus the square root of 7, I get 0.4. Those would be rounded answers, but I want the exact answer here. So we're just going to go with the exact answer. Okay, let's take a look at the last one. X squared plus 13 equals 6x. First thing you want to do, you want to make it equal to 0. You want to move that 6x over. So we're going to say x squared minus 6x plus 13 equals 0. Now, a is 1, b is negative 6, c is positive 13. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. You starting to memorize it yet? So the opposite of negative 6 is positive 6, plus or minus negative 6 squared is 36, minus 4 times 1 times 13, all over 2 times 1. So we're going to get x equals 6 plus or minus 36 minus 4 times 13 is 52, all over 2. Simplifying it more, x equals 6 plus or minus, what's 36 minus 52? Well, it's negative, isn't it? 12 minus 6 is 6. 4 minus 3 is 1. So negative 16 all over 2. Well, I can simplify that. That's 4i, isn't it? All over 2. Well, we're going to write that out as 6 over 2 plus or minus 4i over 2, which is 3 plus or minus 2i. Went over that problem just so you can see what the quadratic formula looks like when you have an imaginary root. So this one would not cross the x-axis ever, and you couldn't factor it. So the only way you can get this answer is by using the quadratic formula, or completing the square, I guess, of 3 plus or minus 2i.